Let's keep the applause going for Houston Smith and Eric Kaplan. Thank you guys. Really appreciate you coming out and doing that. My name is Daryl McCaig. I'm on the board of directors for Kansas City Jazz Alive. Also in the house today, we've got our board president, Chris Burnett, our vice president, BJ Jansen, who is also the one coordinating all of our Spotlight Charlie Parker for this month, and treasurer, Emily Behrman, is in the back as well. So I'm the one that gets to stand up here and give you all the stuff that you really don't want to hear because you came here for other things. But I've got a whole long list of stuff I have to go through. First off, if you've got a parking ticket and you haven't validated it, we have a machine back here that you can get that validated. So your parking ticket does not have a barcode in the very center of it. And so you put it in that machine and it'll put a barcode in the center and spit that back out to you. Don't do it twice, because if you do it twice, it gets all smudged up and the parking thing cannot read your card. But I've been told that if you did do it twice, there's a lady down at the front desk that can fix your ticket for you and get you out of the parking lot. So make sure you do that before you leave. Surveys. You may have gotten one of these cards as you're coming in, and if you're like me, you probably hate doing surveys because I get bombarded with surveys all the time wanting me to fill out surveys. But please, I would like for you to fill out this survey and let me tell you why. We very much appreciate you. You folks come out, you pay your cover charges at clubs, you pay for your admission into our programs here, but that cover charge that you paid for this event today doesn't cover all of our expenses. And so we rely very heavily on submitting grants and getting grants. And so here in a minute, I'm going to read you a whole long list of grants that we've gotten to help us out with Spotlight Charlie Parker. The people that fill those grants and give us that money, they like surveys. They like having that data to be able to say, hey, the money that we're giving is actually going to a good thing. Just like you want to make sure that the money you're giving is going to a good thing. So please fill out the survey so that we can continue to get these grants, because they don't always give them to us every year. We always have to resubmit. So here they come. First off, we've got the Neighborhood Tourist Development Fund, the City of Kansas City, Buttonwood Foundation, Missouri Arts Council, National Endowment for the Arts, Flarsheim Foundation, Francis Family Foundation, Muriel McBrien Kauffman Foundation, a generous donation from Steve Hargrave. We've got the Metzler Initiative at the Folly Theater, the Martha Lee Kane Tranby Music Enrichment Fund. We've also had gifts from Gill Studios, John Santner, Sarah and Jim Weitzner, who are here in the audience with us today, Nina Paul, and then we've had some like-kind gifts through the Jazz Ambassadors with David Bassey in the house, 21C Hotels, as well as the Prairie Village Jazz Festival that's coming up on September 7th. So I think I'm all done with that. Now, I've got one cool thing though I want to show you. One of our guests in the house today brought this to us and has donated this to us. This is a charcoal rubbing of the original Charlie Parker tombstone. So if you look at this, you'll notice that the date for his death is incorrect. I think the date for this is actually the interment of when he was buried in the cemetery. This tombstone got taken down, and Charles Mingus donated money to buy a really nice tombstone with brass plaques for both Charlie Parker and his mother, which is buried next to him. And in '92, that tombstone, actually, let me go back and first say that this original tombstone, after it was taken away, it kind of got lost track of and nobody knew what happened to it. And then it went up for auction through some P.O. box and got sold off to someone, and nobody knows where it actually is. But somebody went out and did this nice charcoal rubbing, so we actually have that. In 1992, the tombstone that Charles Mingus donated got stolen. And so now there's a new tombstone out there for both Charlie and his mother, but unfortunately the engraver didn't realize what he was doing, and he put a tenor saxophone on the tombstone instead of an alto saxophone. So it's just been a comedy of errors and problems. So I hope all of you have tickets for Saturday evening at the Folly Theater. If you don't, we've got these things going around that you can get onto to find out about calendar events and get the ticketing information, or you can go directly to the Folly Theater for that one. We've got the Kansas City Jazz Orchestra that is going to be our featured artist for that night, doing a bunch of music, new big band arrangements of some Charlie Parker music. And then Chuck Haddix is going to be our MC for that night, so I'm sure we'll get a really good history lesson on Charlie Parker as well from Chuck. And I'll just say one more thing. Next Thursday, on Charlie Parker's birthday, there is a whole slew of events happening down at 18th and Vine with the American Jazz Museum. So again, get on this and look. I've been told that one of the events, Chuck Haddix again is going to be doing a preview of an album that's coming out with some previously unreleased Charlie Parker music, including some stuff that he did with the Jay McShann Band. And so that would be a really great event to go to. So anyway, all those things said, let's get to the real feature program here. I want to bring up our moderator, Mr. Steve Kraske. KCR is up to date. He always does a great job, and I'll let him introduce our panelists while I grab some water for all of them.
Daryl, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Hi, everybody. You know, I'm just back from New York, and I was telling Gail in the back that I was at the Vanguard in Birdland, and what I just heard, gentlemen, was as good as anything I heard out there, so thank you very much. That was just great. And what I really liked was coming up the elevator and sort of got louder and louder and louder the closer I got here, so that worked out pretty well. But panelists, come on up, guys, and have a seat. Carolyn, yeah. Houston, yeah, come on up. We're going to be talking this evening during this month of celebration in commemoration of Charlie Parker's birthday, August, every year in Kansas City is sort of Charlie Parker month, and it's become that way for a number of years now. And we're going to be talking a little bit tonight about the genius of Charlie Parker, what made him a genius, you know, why he's as revered among jazz musicians today as he was back then, and why this continues. He's such a remarkable guy, and we're going to find out more about that tonight from this very distinguished panel. Let me introduce them to you now. Carolyn Glenn Brewer is a music educator, clarinetist, and Kansas City jazz historian. She is the author of Beneath Missouri Skies, Pat Metheny in Kansas City, 1964 to 1972. In the middle, you just heard Houston Smith, saxophonist, creative, and entrepreneur. And to my immediate left here, a man who needs little introduction, Carl Allen, endowed professor of jazz studies at UMKC, and just an internationally acclaimed drummer around the world. Let's give our panel a big round of applause here for coming up tonight. Carl, let me start with you. As you look back on it today, what kind of impact did Charlie Parker have on the music? Give us an overview here.
Well, to me, when it comes to Charlie Parker, it's impossible to be a jazz musician or a jazz fan and not be a lover of Charlie Parker's music. He changed the shape of music that we know, and I just remember, of course, I never got a chance to meet him, but I did get a chance to speak about him directly with Max Roach and Dizzy Gillespie and Jackie McLean and many others who did know him. And they would just talk about how listening to him for the first time, like Max would say, it was just listening to someone speak another language. And just how powerful he was in terms of just really changing the vocabulary of this music.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, to say you love jazz, you have to love Charlie Parker.
Yeah. Carolyn, how would you describe it?
Well, I just think that everything he did was infectious. I mean, there was a whole movement going on, and there was a lot of it that was kind of independent of one another, but he kind of brought it all together. I know when he first met Dizzy Gillespie said, "Oh, I finally found my person. You know, I thought I was playing with people that I had something in common with, but this is the guy that really gets what I'm doing." And you know, it stuck up an instant friendship. But there were so many forces coming together at the same time that kind of propelled what he was doing. The whole idea of he being of the first generation that had access to recordings and radio made a huge impact. There's I think, kind of a funny story about him memorizing Lester Young solos. Lester Young was one of his idols, and he studied Lester Young as much as he possibly could from recordings and from hanging out behind bars on 18th Street and listening to him. About the famous summer that he went to the Ozarks and had a gig down there, but to also Woodshed to make up for the embarrassing moment that he had earlier. He was only 15 into 16 at the time. But anyway, he listened to as many Lester Young recordings as he possibly could, and his favorite was the solo that Lester played on Lady Be Good. And the story was, actually Gene Ramey told this story, that when Bird came back, he was playing that solo all over town. In fact, everybody he played it with said, "It's now called Lady Be No Good," because they were tired of hearing it. But he played it so much that Gene Ramey said everybody in the band could sing that solo of Lester Young's because he played it all the time. So just having access to that kind of repeated information, the fact that he was basically self-taught, he was grabbing information everywhere he possibly could and getting it from not just the people that he played with, which he very much did, but also just absorbing all that information. So when he went to New York to stay, he was ready to spread that and to gather more of it. So I think he was very instrumental in, well, we know he was instrumental in the whole movement of bebop, but you know, everybody else that was doing it was really drawn to him too. So it just all kind of happened at the right time.
You know, wouldn't you just love to know what happened to Charlie during that summer in the Ozarks? I mean, there's sort of a whole mythology around that, and you would just love to know what kind of transformation that was for him and what happened down there. Do we know much?
Sweat.
Yeah. I mean, what we know is what all musicians know. You just have to keep playing it until it makes sense. I think that was a big part of it. He was so humiliated by that incident with Jimmy Keith's band where he was playing the wrong tune and they laughed him off the stage. But he was only 15. You know, that's pretty amazing in itself.
And Joe Jones threw the cymbal or something?
That was later. That was a year later.
Year later, okay.
Yeah, there were two incidences. But when he went to the Ozark that time, he was playing a gig. He was playing with George Wilkerson's, I had some funny title to the band, but anyway, he was a bass player, and he played that gig. But he had the days free, and so he just woodshed it. He learned the rest of the keys. He could only play in one key when he went to play with Jimmy Keith earlier that year. So I think mostly he played gigs, so he was, there's no place to hide when you're up there on the stand. And he just practiced. He said he practiced like 15 hours a day if he could,
Wow.
if he wasn't playing a gig. And then he listened. He listened to as many recordings as possible.
So Houston, for you, there's not much mystery here. You think, as you just said, in a single word, more so succinctly, he just sweat a lot.
Well,
Yeah, grab that mic a little bit.
I think there's more mystery for me because I actually have to figure out how to make my fingers move that quickly, in addition to just listening to the music, right? Given that he is a saxophonist and literally the premier saxophonist to trailblaze this language, it's even more mysterious or even more challenging figuring out how he was able to be so consistent and how he was able to discover something that was uniquely his own and then be able to share that with the world. That takes, I said sweat, but really I meant consistency, focus, intention, drive, all of these things that really are perhaps lesser thought about when making a complete musician, but essentials that if they're truly mastered, lead to legends like Charlie Parker, like like Dizzy Gillespie, like from that lineage to the Carl Allens of today, right? That is the kind of commitment that requires.
You alluded to it a second ago. You play a similar instrument. Can you describe for us lay people just how fast Charlie moved?
Good luck.
And in that breath, you've already missed it. It's a really meticulous craft, and it's a really meticulous way of approaching the saxophone that, again, those things that I just mentioned, if you have no focus, if you have no intention, if you have no drive, if you have no dedication, even if you were to move your fingers to hit the same keys that Charlie Parker played, the intention and the drive and the focus and the feeling would be absent then at that point because you'd just be reading. So without that, again, the full package of that, it's not totally complete, and that's something that is never complete, which is why this thing is a continual journey. You never arrive, so to speak, but it's amazing to see how far he was on his journey at a similar, well, not too much older than me when he passed, and so I'm still on the journey, just trying to run as fast as I can to get to where he was at my age.
You know, as a young guy listening to him, did he set the bar too high? Is there an intimidation factor that might even be discouraging at times?
Never intimidating for me. So I came to Bird through, when I was young, first started playing the saxophone, I tried to play the drums first, Mr. Allen. And then...
Everyone does.
And they sent me home, which I'm sure some of your kids were sent home to annoy you with those little plastic flute-like recorder things, right? And so the thing about it is I would not be a saxophonist. I thought drums were really the thing. But I happened upon a young lady who told me 11 words that changed my perspective. She said, "Are you aware that saxophone and recorder are the same thing?" And I said, "No, I wasn't aware of that." So that made that transitional period of elementary school a lot easier because I'm a frustrated singer. So when I came to Bird, I came to him after making the recorder to saxophone switch, and the first set of Bird, or the first sounds of Bird that I heard were two ways. One recommendation from my father. He had a musician friend who he asked, "Hey, my son just started playing saxophone. What songs should he learn? Who should he check out?" And the parallel of music that he received from his friend was Ronnie Law's Friends and Strangers to Charlie Parker, Donna Lee. So those were the two songs that, well, if you want to play saxophone, you need to learn Friends and Strangers and Donna Lee. So that was my first introduction. A couple of weeks later, my friend's father, who was also an enthusiast, my best friend, we were convinced that we were going to start a duo touring sax band or something like this at some point, young in elementary school. His father bought him the best of some record companies, the best of collection. So the best of John Coltrane, the best of Dizzy Gillespie, the best of Charlie Parker, the best of all of Gene Ammons, all of these best of collector's sets. And so about 2 weeks in, he brought these about 4 CDs, and he said, "Hey man, I'm not really into these. Do you want them?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll keep them for a while." And so 3 of them were the best of Bird, and the other was, I believe, I think it was like the best of Diz or Gene Ammons, I can't remember. But the 3 that I played the most off my little alarm clock CD player that was sitting in my room at the time was Bird. And so I came to his music not knowing titles, not having sought out an omnibook first to become acquainted with the music, just putting on something that my friend said that he didn't like to see if I could like it. And certainly I did. So that was the internalization or my first introduction to Bird, so to speak. And that's been some time ago, and I'm still listening to those records, trying to internalize that way. So.
Wow. Carl, how often does his name still come up when you do gigs? You're in New York, you're getting around the world. How often do you hear the name Charlie Parker?
Almost every day.
Yeah, grab that mic.
You know, it's really almost every day. You know, so but let me back up for a moment, because the thing that we sometimes forget, to be able to do what Bird did, you have to have a lot of conviction, a lot of courage, and deep vision and insight. Because if you know, for all of us who understand history, we know that during this period in particular, any style that came along, it was a revolt of what was happening before, right? So when they came up with bebop, it was because they didn't want to do what people were doing before. But to have the courage to say, I'm hearing something different, and I'm going to do this at a high level, and then to just change the landscape, you know, because, you know, Dizzy would talk about how they would, you know, put, you know, handkerchiefs over their fingers so people couldn't see the fingerings and different things like that. But, and we forget also the level of intellect that it takes to be able to do that, right? Like, I remember when the movie Bird came out, I was on tour with Jackie McLean in Europe, and they premiered it at this festival in Umbria, Italy. And I sat there with Dizzy and Max and a few other people, and Jackie cried. He cried because he felt that the movie had done Bird a disservice. Because there was a scene in the movie where Bird had gone to Dizzy's house and had this tune and said, "Can you write this out for me?" As if he was musically illiterate.
Right.
But he said Bird really was a genius. And so when we see how these things are depicted, not understanding really the level of genius that it takes. And it just reminds me, you know, Wayne Shorter would talk about Bird all the time. And he referenced Bird. He said, you know, Carl, I don't know if any of you all ever met Wayne, but if you have a conversation, if you ever had a conversation with Wayne and you walked away understanding what he was saying, you're one in the minority. Because Wayne would say stuff, you just like, man, I don't know what that was. But one of the things he used to say about Bird was that it takes courage to be happy. And he would say with Bird, you know, it took courage for him to be able to say, this is how I'm hearing myself represented, and this is how I hear music, and this is who I am. You know, and he did it so convincingly that, just like Louis Armstrong, he brought some folks with him, you know. And of course, that changed the whole landscape of the music at that time.
Yeah, and I wanted to, Carolyn, jump off something Carl just said about where bebop came from, this reaction to what had gone on before. There was a sense back then that the sustaining big bands economically, black big bands, wasn't going to continue much longer. It wasn't working. And then there's this transition to dance halls and smaller listening venues. How significant was that moment for the music? Am I describing that accurately as far as
so.
You're seeing it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was a huge thing. I mean, even though this was kind of percolating all through the 40s, after World War II, it just got to be too expensive to travel around with the buses and, even just driving cars. It was too expensive to tour so with a big band. So the whole idea of having a smaller group made a lot of sense economically. But all through that time, the jam sessions that were going on after the gigs were really where a lot of this was happening. These guys would play maybe up until, sometime. I think the Reno Club's regular gigs stopped at 2 in the morning, and then they would have the jams after that would go till dawn. So that really was where a lot of it was happening. The people that came to those jams really wanted to figure all that out. They wouldn't even necessarily have a specific tune. It would just be like rhythm changes or just playing on that. They just would do whatever came naturally, and they were all learning together on that. And that was something that Bird really went to a lot, even though he was still a teenager. His mother worked nights, so he managed to get out of the house pretty easily during the night, and he'd go to 18th and Vine and just kind of hang out in the alleyways. Not just 18th and Vine, but all through that district. Any place there was a club where somebody was playing that he wanted to hear, he would just go hang out outside, and if they had the door open in the back, he could hear the music. And he and Gene Ramey did that. He and a high school friend of his named Robert Simpson did that. And that was just the way of educating himself some more. So a lot of those guys would end up going to jam sessions after the gigs, and he would do that too. So it was coming at him from all sides, really. But I think those jam sessions were really, really important.
Maybe another way to ask it, Carl, was bebop inevitable? What if there had been no Charlie and Dizzy, but there was this transition from the big bands to the smaller groups? Where would the music have gone? I mean, was there a trend at that point that then Charlie and Dizzy interrupted the trend? Was it heading in one direction, or am I getting too speculative here?
That seemed like the most natural progression to me, because when we think about whenever there's been a change in the music, we can pinpoint rhythmically, harmonically, and melodically that there was changes. So with bebop, the rhythms became more complex, people started playing faster, and there was much more sophisticated harmonies, right? Because we're leaving the dance period, so now this is really more about the player. And so I think that was really, seemed like the most natural progression. Yeah.
Houston, you're a young guy. How often does the name Charlie Parker come up in your circles?
I mean, a lot of the otherwise young guys, I guess, that you would associate me with, we all consider ourselves to be rather old. So,
I got news for you.
I got news for you. Once you hit 50, you start over. So some folks, I might have a couple of years on some folks by that principle. But again, we consider ourselves old souls. And so that likewise our music or our interests are seasoned, let's say. And so because of that, we're always discussing, hey man, did you check out this record? Eric and I, every time we play together, it's a hang in the parking lot talking about music, and then, hey man, I was listening to this today. Check this out. This is Herbie, Ron, and Miles at such and such and such and such. Check this record out. Check this. And I feel like we have such a wealth of information at our fingertips that kind of learning, I call it active listening otherwise, but that kind of learning is always going on, or should always be going on from a musician's perspective. So I'm filtering the music. I'm not just casually turning on the radio to listen to whatever 102.7 has to say. I have a specific...
Because you'd be going to 89.3 KCUR.
Well, to catch Steve Kraske, of course.
Yeah,
your show, actually, and 90.1 are the only local stations.
I don't know what the hell you were just talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shows you I don't listen to, it proves my point, you know? And so that kind of listening is just really important. And I think it can be really beneficial, but not a lot of people are hip to that, let's say.
Right.
So.
Carolyn, another historical note that Daryl so astutely points out here, that mid-40s, Norman Granz starts this series, The Jazz at the Philharmonic, and moves bebop into before large audiences, large auditoriums. Charlie Parker takes part in a lot of those. What's the impact on jazz with those concerts through Norman Granz, and how does that affect the direction of jazz?
Well, I think that made a huge difference too, and it's kind of remarkable to realize that he was just 25 when he started doing that, and he started it on $300 of borrowed money. And the first one was in July of 1944.
I'm sorry, Norman started those?
Right.
You're talking about, yeah, not
Right.
Charlie, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Right.
Norman Granz started that. And it was brilliant, really. His goal was to get the jazz musicians a bigger venue. I mean, it was great going to the clubs, but yeah, like you said, he wanted to put them in concert halls so that more people could hear them, that they'd make a lot more money than they would on a club gig, and that, that they could travel around. You know, it wouldn't be a stationary thing. It started out in LA at Philharmonic Auditorium there, but by the next year, he was organizing them in cities all over the country. So it gave them a bigger place to play. More people were hearing them, because not everybody could go to New York or Chicago or LA to hear them in a club. And they were making more money through the whole thing. But also he started one of his many record labels. This particular one was called Clef. And that's where all these guys recorded. So what a brilliant thing. You book the concerts, you record them, and then you put them out on albums. So he was spreading it all over the place. And one of the most significant things that he did, and this is not musical, but it's culturally, it was brilliant, and it was a wonderful thing. He refused to have any kind of segregated venue or groups. He made sure that when you went to a jazz at the Philharmonic concert, it was going to be desegregated. And if any of the venues that came to him and said, okay, we'd like for you to come, said that they would have a segregated audience, he said, then, well, we won't be there. And he stuck to that. And this was in the 50s. This was before the civil rights movement really started. So that was a great blow, or it was a great strike for individual freedom and the whole progression of civil rights. So it was a great thing for him to do.
So yeah, Carl, go. Yeah.
So there's a promoter in Barcelona, in Spain. I was just there a couple of months ago. His name is Jordi Suñol, and Jordi was a protege of Norman Granz.
Wow.
And for years, up until about maybe 15 years ago, he would tour, put bands together called Jazz at the Philharmonic. I did a number of them for a number of years, so that was still very much alive, yeah.
Yeah. So between roughly 45 and 50, Charlie Parker sort of belongs to the world. He's no longer just Kansas City. He's an international figure. There's evidence he came back to Kansas City in July of '51. He plays at Municipal Auditorium here with the Woody Herman Orchestra, primarily a white band, I should point out. But did Kansas City forget about Charlie Parker, in your view, Carolyn? Did he leave us somehow?
Well, first, I just want to say something about that particular gig, because this was really interesting, and Daryl brought this particular gig to our attention, but he wasn't booked to play with Woody Herman that night. He just happened to be in town. Actually had a gig at Tootie's Mayfair part of that week, but
Which was where?
well, at that point, well, no, I think this time it was 40 Highway way east. Well, they were at three. They had three different
David
locations.
Bassey would know. Yeah.
But anyway, it was It was outside of city limits. That was the main point. But anyway, he was here in town. The report that I read was from one of the sax players in Woody Herman's band, and he said that Charlie, promoters had figured out that he was here, so they wanted to have him at this concert. So they talked him into coming and just being like a guest artist. And because one of the other reasons that Charlie was here was to see his mother, he was pretty sober and straight, because he said she wouldn't tolerate it. She wouldn't let him stay there if he was high. So he was in good shape, and he came and did this concert. He didn't know, he knew what was in the Woody Herman book, but he didn't know the arrangements. No rehearsal, walks in, takes a look at it, and plays it just like he'd written it himself. But afterwards, after the concert was over, he said, well, I got to go out to Tootie's Mayfair and do my late gig, and he brought a bunch of the guys from Woody Herman's band with him. So that anybody that was at Tootie's that night got a real treat, having part of the Woody Herman band there too. But what was your question?
I was going to say, you're really evading my question here, Carolyn. Which was, to what extent did Kansas City lose track of Charlie? Did we no longer regard him as, a native son? Did we let him go somehow? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, there may have been some of that at the beginning. He kind of burned a lot of bridges, with players and band leaders, just because of his irresponsible behavior when he was not straight. And there's all kinds of stories about that. But so there was a period where he didn't want to be here, and the band leaders were kind of letting him go. But it seems like as time went on, he became more appreciated. And certainly, I've looked through a whole bunch of newspaper articles, from like 48 to 55. And especially in the Call, there were quite a few articles about him. I think, people were keeping track of him.
How about the Star?
Some.
I'm afraid to ask, by the way, but yeah.
Not as much. Yeah.
Some?
Generally, if it was about a bigger topic and they just happened to include what he was doing or what he had said.
Yeah. Is it your feeling, did he ever get in his lifetime the respect that he so richly deserved?
I think he did in general, but maybe not here.
Maybe not here.
Yeah, it's hard to say. And Jay McShann, who, as far as I can tell, was had patience like, classic patience. He even, he didn't want to hire him to begin with because of Bird's reputation. Gene Ramey, again, was really after Jay the whole time about, no, come on, we need him in the section. It'd just be great if he was in the section. So Jay McShann finally said, okay, here's the deal. I'll hire him, but you have to be in charge of him. You have to basically be his keeper. You have to pick him up for the gigs, make sure he gets to the gigs, and after the gigs, you drive him home, make sure he gets into the house. Don't just drop him off. Don't let him talk you into taking him anywhere. And I even want you to keep his horn, because I'm afraid he's going to hawk it. He was known to even borrow a horn and then hawk it. So, Jay had legitimate worries. Well, it all worked out. He played with them for 4 years. But, people were kind of disgusted with him. But through all of this, Bird realized that he was getting a calling. He was hearing what nobody else in Kansas City wanted to do. That was the bottom line. He knew he had to get out, because he was never going to be able to play the way he knew he was meant to play if he kept playing with the people that he had been playing with.
Houston, can I assume that you're not as difficult as Charlie Parker to work with, or is that...
Depends on who you ask, I guess. Yeah, speaking to kind of what Carolyn was just saying, I think understanding your environment is really crucial. And I think that oftentimes, although we do have a very vibrant scene in Kansas City, I feel like some of that vibrance clouds some of the other push that would otherwise push some other Kansas City musicians out into different environments. It's one of the reasons why, although I love my city, born and raised here, I didn't want to attend college here for that exact same reason.
Wait, translate what you just said for me, so you're just be plain with me. What are you talking about?
Sure. So the same way that Bird left Kansas City and explored other places, and as a result was able to make a bigger impact. He realized the barriers, so to speak, that were in Kansas City, and he realized that although he would likely play and still be revered and everything else locally, he realized that his calling or his mission was greater than that, which required him to step out of his otherwise hometown and make a bigger leap and make a bigger stretch. And I wish that some Kansas City musicians, that the scene, although it is vibrant here, I wish that that same kind of reach or stretch or push would be more evident. We have some great Kansas City musicians in all genres, if you wish to go down that road, but what you find is that all of them made the same or similar leap that Bird did, and a lot of their success or a lot of their success, basically, and a lot of their legacy was at least started or enriched by their time outside of Kansas City. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely something that's vital. Like I said, that's.
Carolyn, can you track when Charlie, got the respect he was owed in Kansas City? Was it only after he died in '55? And how much further down the road do you have to go before people began to say, hey, he was really something special in a broad way, even outside the jazz community?
That's a good question. I think they knew it in New York right away. I mean, right away, right after his funeral. Bird Lives was on graffiti all over town.
Yeah.
But I don't know. That's a hard question to answer.
Yeah.
But I mean, certainly by the 70s, I mean, we had the Charlie Parker Center. There was a lot of education going on there. I mean, the statue at 18th and Vine.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all been maybe in the last 50 years.
Yeah. If he walked into the room right now, Houston, you had a chance to talk to him, what do you want to know? What would you sit down and say, Charlie, talk to me about this? What would you want him to tell you about?
I think I would ask two questions that would kind of basically sum up everything that I would want to know. How do you deal with, I guess, what some would call failure? And
meaning during a gig or more broadly?
General, broadly. Mm-hmm. And also, what are you thinking about when you feel that you're spot on? And what are you thinking about when you feel like you're not? And how does the interplay of your life come out of your horn? Sure, we could go over how were you thinking about the Slanimsky pattern number 32 when you were going over? Yeah, we could, but really, I really seek to understand him in the only interpersonal way that I otherwise can't, because he's not physically with us.
Yeah.
That's what I would want to know.
Well, let me ask a question about technique, and I should precede this by saying that this comes from Chris Burnett, so everyone can just hang on to their seats here a little bit.
I'll decode it. I was a student of his. So.
Charlie once said, I found that by using the higher intervals of a chord as a melody line and backing them with appropriately related changes, I could play the thing I'd been hearing. I came alive. And he's describing there the revelation he experienced while practicing the song Cherokee. Do you know what he's talking about, Houston?
I hear what he means when I put on a record.
Higher intervals of a chord as a melody line and backing them with appropriately related changes.
So, yeah, there's a couple of different ways that we could go about this, right? And for the sake of everyone else in the room, because I'm sure us music enthusiasts would enjoy this conversation, but I'm trying to make it as less academic as possible, right?
Talk to me a little bit, yeah, to keep it basic.
So, basically, when you have a scale, right? Let's say the scale has 7 notes, right? Let's use a C scale for example. This is getting frighteningly academic, right? The more we go about this. But you have 7 notes, and you only have those 7 notes. That's the key. So after 7, what would come next? I'm asking. After 7?
8.
Right, or 1 in this sense, right? Because we don't have more than 7 notes, right? We only have 7 notes. It was a trick question.
Houston, don't embarrass the
I
moderator.
know, okay.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. We have these 7 notes, and like I said, once you get to 7, you start back over at 1. So when he's talking about higher intervals, he's talking about nothing. He's talking about higher octaves, essentially. So he's talking about perhaps the same note, right? But let's say if I have, now I'm not gonna. My horn is over there, and I really don't want to sing. B flat is here, A, or B flat, C is here, right? So if that C is now up an octave, the second note, right? And we were counting up those 7 notes, and we know that C is the second note, it would be 2, but if we continued, again, remember, there's only 7 notes, that's the key. If we continued counting, we'd get 7, 8, or 1. 9 would be the next number. So when we get really academic and we talk about using all these higher numbers to illustrate different notes, those higher intervals were really just talking about higher octaves, so to speak, a higher octave of whatever note. So it's easier played explained than verbally explained, but I hope that kind of makes some sense without being too academic.
How do you do, Carl?
It was great.
Did he?
That's code for I don't know.
Okay, just one more, and again, we can get to Chris here and blame him for this. The way he approached the blues, his innovation was the use of something called back cycle 2 through 5 progressions within the 12-measure jazz blues form. Okay. Do you know what he's talking about?
All right, so.
Do you want to grab your horn?
Yeah.
Grab the horn. Give him a round of applause. Grab the horn. Yeah, absolutely.
So basically, let's just call them 3 different kind of blues song forms. The first originated from the gospel church. This is a hymn called Glory, Glory, Hallelujah. Just play a chord. 1, 2, 3. that call and response hymn was the basis for what we came to understand as a blues form, or was kind of, again, the launching pad for whatever genres, whether you're talking about blues that sounds to you like rock and roll, whether you're talking about blues to you that sounds like blues, whether you're talking to blues that sounds like Americana or roots music, all of it has that root, or is rooted in the Black American experience through the Black church. So the second form, after that very general hymn style of blues, would be just a regular blues, which sounds to you, from what Eric is playing, would sound similar. Here's what Bird did. He started adding these different, as Steve said, these 2/5 progressions, which don't try to figure out what that means, but understand where they happen. Because if you understand where they happen, then you're able to know, okay, yeah, that sounds to me like something that Charlie Parker did, or that sounds different from the other music that I call blues, or that I call rock and roll, or whatever, but it's actually the same thing. It's just Charlie's flavor on it. So play a bird, just a bird blues. Yeah, yeah. One, again, without getting too technical, so you just play that 1, 2, but the bird changes. Here, okay, that's enough. See, once you get going, it's not right? But those different chord changes that he was putting in there, the form is still universally the same. Again, it's still a blues form. Right? Or it's still call it Stormy Mondays. It's still that essential blues form in terms of how we recognize it. But again, there's different types. So Bird started innovating. Instead of just playing straight up blues that you'd hear late night, or straight up blues that Kansas City is famous for, and a lot of times, he started innovating. Probably because he got bored and said, okay, I'm going to start making my own thing. Right? Or I'm going to start innovating or writing down what I'm hearing in my head conceptually. And that what he wrote down became on paper, and became what we hear, or what we know as bird changes or bird blues. So anytime anybody is saying, oh, we're playing bird changes, or it's a bird blues, that kind of movement that you heard, even though you don't understand the technical numbers and what's going where and all of that, that's the general sound of it. If I had to do it in this format, or less. I'm taking too much time on that one answer, but hopefully.
No, that's great. No, nice job. Carol, does jazz education focus enough on the contributions of Charlie Bird, in your view? Charlie Parker, in your view?
Never enough. Okay, so, I have one of my students here, and one of the things that I've always felt that was important is for us to learn tunes. We talked about going to jam sessions. So, when we start learning tunes, one of the things that happens is that we now have a common language where we can have conversation with people that we've never met before. that language come from these standards, right? And so, you know, and every year when we put together our tune list, which we were just dealing with today, I'm always conscious of the fact that we need to have a Charlie Parker tune in there. Because that's something that if you learn some Bird tunes, it doesn't matter where in the world you can go to a jazz club, and if the club is worth anything, they have musicians there that know some Bird tunes. And that's just part of the fabric of this music. So, but to answer the question, do we do enough of it? No, you know. But part of my mindset is when we talk about education, part of what our job is just to open up the door to this information, and that the students then will start to be able to explore even more on their own, because no institution can teach you everything. You know,
Yeah.
A lot of it is about what you learn from other musicians and on the scene and in the community.
How has the music changed since Charlie Parker's time in terms of, you know, the music's always evolving, always changing? How would you describe that? How much would Bird recognize of it today?
But see, we say it's always changing, but sometimes we say that because we just don't know the history. Right? Because the thing is, when I hear people say, well, I'm playing contemporary jazz, what is that? And so when we start looking at what people call contemporary jazz, now, before the jazz police come out with the handcuffs, I love all styles of music, but when I hear people say, well, man, I'm just, you know, I'm trying to do something new, it's like, nah, that's already been done. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But sometimes it's really an attempt to try to find a shortcut, right? But you still got to go back to the bebop language. You still have to deal with the blues, because what we're not trying to do is to reinvent the wheel. Where's the foundation of this music? It's the blues, it's gospel. All of that comes from a place that we have to make sure it's part of this music that we call jazz. So, you know, I remember one of my good friends, alto saxophonist Kenny Garrett, said when he was playing with Miles used to always say, you know, people were upset that he was playing funk. And he says, it's still just the blues. So he said it was still coming out of the blues, you know. But a lot of times when we say, I want to do something hip, and we say, okay, well, explain to me what that is. Well, you got to do this. Okay, well, hold on a second. Let me put this record on from '72 where Herbie was already done that. And it's like, oh, yeah. So, you know, it's all cyclical, you know.
You know, Carolyn, as you look at this, we spend the month of August with so many events trying to commemorate Bird and his legacy. Even with that, do you think Kansas City's doing enough to remember Charlie Parker?
I don't know how you would even define enough. Yeah. I mean, it's wonderful that there is recognition. It's wonderful that this festival goes on. It's, you know, and then Carl's making sure that the students at UMKC are getting more exposure and you know, everything that's happening. But it's hard to define what enough would be, because still there are people, I mean, I know, I'm telling our next door neighbors, we're walking to the car, what we were doing, they would have no idea who we were talking about.
Right.
You know, it's still, it's not as common knowledge here as it probably is in other cities, or certainly in Europe and Japan. I mean, they seem to have more knowledge of that. In fact, my brother's a jazz musician who, he hasn't done too much traveling lately, but he played with Jerry Mulligan and did a lot of touring in Europe, a lot of jazz festivals and stuff. And he said every time he'd get on, you know, in a social situation in Europe, and people would ask him in English where he was from, and he'd say Kansas City. Invariably, wherever he was, they'd always say, oh, Charlie Parker. I don't think that happens here so much.
Yeah.
Houston, how do you wrestle with that question? Are we doing enough?
Well, again, the fact that it doesn't happen as often as it should in Kansas City is evidence that our work is never finished. Just when you've thought, oh, it was a great year, we had a great turnout, and we had all these people coming to the Vivid Visions panel, and it was great, right? But to Carolyn's point, there was somebody who, if you said, where are you going? I'm going to the Vivid Visions panel at the Kansas City Central Library. It's Spotlight Charlie Parker Week, and there's so much going on, and yada, yada. That person glazed over like a deer in the headlights, right? So it's about not only recognizing who Charlie Parker is, but placing a more of an importance as to where they come from as a Kansas Citian, because it's not just Charlie Parker who contributed to the music that they know and love today, who they'd associate or say has nothing to do with Charlie Parker. So it's really about educating on a broader scale and really kind of speaking to the same connectivity and cyclical nature that Mr. Allen was talking about. That's the essential part. That's how you draw in folks who, again, likely wouldn't ever visit a jazz club or find themselves seeking out that kind of experience.
What does that look like, is broadening the educational land? Are we talking about a jazz festival? Are you something come to mind here in terms of what would push that forward?
Well, the same way that I'd say simply just more relationship building, because the same way you asked me what I would ask Bird if we were in the same room, and I just wanted to know about who he was, what he liked, nothing musical, really. That same kind of relation from those who are in the community needs to translate in outreach to folks who maybe aren't as connected. And I think that the conversation, a lot of the time, because of genre labels or whatever else, gets too academic too quickly. And you turn people off, you lose people who would otherwise be interested, but...
Just for the record, I hung with you there. I was hanging in there with you.
See?
Yeah.
You know, that's... So, you know, that's the important thing is also, while you're seeking to educate, figuring out how to meet people where they're at in order to engage them. Then once you've got them, you've got them. But yeah, it's the getting them that's the trick.
You know, Carl, you go to a lot of cities, not only in this country, but around the world. Any thoughts you have about how do we need to push this legacy forward more aggressively?
Well, I just really think for all of us to try to continue to present it at the highest possible level, and people will come. You just can't water it down. I mean, it's funny, as I was driving here, I think there's a concert or something maybe down here somewhere, because I see all these young women walking with shorts on and cowboy hats and stuff on, and these big buses down here. So there's and I just kept thinking, boy, if I were to stop and ask them about Charlie Parker, they'd look at,
yeah,
what?
yeah.
You know, but you realize it's with this art form, maybe it's never really meant to be for those same kind of numbers that will go to the T-Mobile Center or whatever. You know, it's just we have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
Because when we're not okay with that, then we start dumbing down the music to try to attempt to appeal to the masses.
That's a good point.
And then the music suffers. There you go. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. What questions do we have in the audience? Yeah. Yes, sir.
I project pretty well, so I don't need a mic. Two questions. You said he was self-taught. He was a genius. To what extent did teaching himself allow him to not be constrained by an orthodoxy? To what extent did that allow him to expand into where he was going?
Let's do that one first. Yeah. Don't all jump at once.
I don't know. I think if I had to say, I'd just say freedom of exploration. not having a specific agenda to necessarily be tied to, but exposing yourself to everything. So sure, he was playing, as Carolyn mentioned, like straight up blues gigs that had nothing to do perhaps with how this music would come to sound. But during the day or during those 15-hour practice sessions, he was also studying through the Slonimsky book, which is out of many others, but which is for saxophonists or reed players or woodwind players of any sort, is the classical book of all classical books. So, or one of anyway. And so that kind of openness, again, allowed multiple influences to be able to come into, and he allowed those to then shape what it was that he had inside of him anyway. So I think it was very beneficial.
And I think, he started playing professionally when he was 15.
So that's the teacher.
So, and he did have a really good band director at Lincoln High School, we'll say that. Alfonso Davis, that even one of his first mentors, even one of Charlie Parker's first mentors, after he graduated, came back to school just to hang out in the band room to get more knowledge from Alfonso Davis. Charlie also, from the beginning, latched on to people who were a little bit older than him, sometimes more than a little bit older than him, that he recognized that they had a lot more musical knowledge than he did. And, he wasn't being an opportunist or anything. He just was trying to learn from them, and they learned from him because he was coming up with stuff that they'd never thought of. But he did that over and over again. And that gave him different perspectives. Again, the fact that he could listen to the radio. In 1935, when he started playing, there were 20 radio stations in Kansas City. And they weren't all Kansas City radio stations. You could get New York, you could get Chicago, you could get Dallas. There were all kinds of radio stations that he had access to. And big bands were on multiple times during the day. So, there are days where you could listen to Count Basie 3 times a day. So, he had lots of, now we have YouTube and Spotify and everything, but he found ways to get that information. And by jamming and hanging out with these people that had more knowledge than him, he also pretty early on discovered 20th century orchestral music. He really, really felt an affinity to Stravinsky in particular, but also Ravel and Hindemith. He was known to quote even Saber Dance of Khachaturians. I've heard a quote this week from Ferdy Groffe's Grand Canyon Suite, and the Habolero from Carmen, Bizet's Carmen. He was very well educated in the classics as well as classical jazz stuff too. So I think he realized very early on that his mind was taking him to places that he didn't see anybody else going. When I say early on, I mean like 15, 16 years old. So he was he was doing an independent study thing right from the beginning.
Carol, is there a concern out there that jazz education, formal jazz education, straps down young players too much? I don't know. Inhibits creativity somehow?
Well, I just think it depends on the environment. But I want to get to that, but I just want to piggyback on the other question, because we have to remember that from an educational institutions, jazz was considered illegal. Benny Golson told me when he was a student at Howard that the professors told them, if we hear you play jazz in the building, you're getting kicked out.
Wow.
And this is in America, right? We would, and I remember my first time going to Europe, certain parts of Europe and Eastern Germany and Russia and Poland, it was illegal. So, when we say education is just open to everyone, it really wasn't open to everyone, so. But in terms of your question, I think the environment makes a difference. One of the things that I know is that, let me be nice. Those who can do. And what do I mean by that? I go to a lot of schools, high schools, universities, and you spend time with the jazz program and there's nobody playing jazz. And then they will quite often say, well, the students don't really want to do that. That's why we're playing Snarky Puppy and we're doing so okay. And I'm an old head, so I'm thinking, well, if I was a pre-med student and I said I want to be a doctor, but I don't want to dissect that frog, I'm not going to be a doctor. It's just what it is, right? So, you know, and I understand part of what's driven this whole thing are numbers, right? We don't want to get too deep into all of that, but
Right.
So you have programs that kind of dumb it down because they need to attract the numbers and all, but the integrity still has to be there. And I still do think one of the things that we've been trying to do is to still try to keep it relevant. So in other words, we're talking about jazz and the students have to learn standards. At some point, the conversation has to move away from just the American songbook, right? So it can't just be Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hammerstein, the Gershwins, right? Because you know what? None of those families need any more money, right? Mulgrew Miller, his wife could use some money. Roy Hargrove, and we can just keep going. And even people who are still living, who are still great composers. And so when we start talking about trying to move the needle forward with jazz, I think we have to say what you said before, meet people where they are, right? Because one of the reasons why you get so much resistance from young people to study this music is they still see it as this is a museum art form where we're just playing music by dead people. And that's part of it. But there's another live and vibrant part about it that we have to continue to put at the forefront.
Yeah, one more, Chris, and this is, yeah.
Dr. Allen, before a student comes to you at the conservatory, they basically have developed a baseline of competence, correct? And when you're out giving clinics or recruiting, that's what you're looking for someone who's going to be successful in your program, correct? And how can we do a better job, those of us educating young people to go to you or someone like you?
That's a great question. Well, I'll tell you one of the challenges that we have is that many of the students who are applying to college now are fundamentally deficient, right? So many schools, right, and they don't understand fundamentals, right? So, and because so many kids we get that are passionate and some with talent just don't play the instrument well. And part of that is because many of them have never had teachers. And you say, well, man, where did you learn to do that? Oh, from YouTube. And they've never had private lessons, right? So when we start talking about really wanting to address jazz education, we have to deal with it at a much earlier level so that when kids are coming through to audition for colleges, that they're able to play the instrument well. So that's my thing. I want you to play the instrument well. If you play the instrument well, you can go in a lot of different directions, stylistically speaking. So that's something that we have to understand. And as educators, we have to not be afraid to just be truthful about what the music is. And again, we're not trying to be jazz police and say, you can't listen to this, you can't listen to that. But here's the foundation of this music. Now, if you don't want to play jazz music, it's okay, right? There's a lot of other stuff you can do. But if you say you want to do this, this is what you have to know. You got to know the blues. You got to be able to swing. And trust me, not everybody can do that, you know? But there's a place for everybody. I'm just saying, we dumb it down to the point to where it starts to become an insult to the music and to people like Charlie Parker, right? So, but let me just say one last thing, and this is, I apologize if this comes off as a shameless plug, because that's not the intent. But I'm just thinking about the power of Charlie Parker, right? So in January, this past January, I did my first record as a leader in 20 years, probably, because before that I did some as a co-leader. And I did a trio record, and I didn't have any rehearsals. I had Christian McBride, Chris Potter. And I just said, man, I just wanted a record that felt like jazz. And I put together a whole list of tunes. And something about being in the studio, and it was Rudy Van Gelder's studio where they did, you know, Blue Train and all these other great recordings. And as soon as I got in the studio with this long list of tunes that I'm passing out, something just hit me and said, Carl, you cannot do a jazz record without putting on a Bird tune. Mm-hmm. Right? We recorded, you know, Parker's Mood, and it was just, and when I said this to McBride and to Chris, and we all said, well, man, what tune can we do? And it was almost like we were reading the script. We were like, let's do Parker's Mood. And like all three of us said it at the same time, right? So when you start talking about Charlie Parker and the legacy, this is something that crosses many genres, many generations, and you know, you figure how many years is this after he's passed, and this music is still relevant. We're all trying to still reach that bar that he established, which is a very, very high bar.
That's a great note to end on. What a great panel. Carolyn, Houston, Carl, yeah, round of applause. Thank you so much. That was just terrific. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. It's really a pleasure, man. Pleasure listening to you. Thank you.
This was fun.
You all thought you were coming to a Bird 101 class, but this was 501, so. Thank you all very much for coming out, and we hope to see you Saturday night at the Folly Theater. And don't forget to get your parking tickets validated.